particular first episode for him on Week in Perspective. And also we have our resident analyst and one of the pioneers who we started off Week in Perspective with, and that is Ken Gishinga. He's also with us this afternoon. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for making time.
Thank you, Abi. Good to see you.
Thank you. All right. So it has been a very interesting week where we did see the president issuing a couple of statements from Mombasa, and it was regarded as a very momentous speech looking at 2020, where he is directing the country towards, and there seems to be a critical focus on the economy, putting money in the pockets of Mwananchi. Those were his words. And one of the key issues that did come up, of course, was around the directives he did issue, touching on the tea sector, the dairy sector, and of course, he also did come out strongly when it came to the judiciary. But for this afternoon, gentlemen, I'd like us to first unpack. He also did make some cabinet changes where we did see a few names around the principal secretaries were dropped, and we did see some newcomers into the team. And one of the newcomers, of course, is Mutahi Kagwe, and he'll be steering the health docket. But more interestingly, no one ever imagined or no one ever saw this coming, that Ukur Yatani will be the substantive Treasury Cabinet Secretary. And of course, I'm saying this with utter respect to him. He has the credentials, but it was that docket that you always felt, and the way the politics of the day have played, is the appointee must be a very close ally of the president. So let me kick it off with you, Ken. What do you make of this issue around Ukur taking over? And before you make your comments, I'd like us to just play this quick clip around what will be characterizing his entry as he takes over office as Treasury Cabinet Secretary.
During his State of the Nation address on the 14th of January 2020, President Uhuru Kenyatta confirmed Ukur Yatani as the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury. Yatani was named the acting CS in July 2019, following the suspension of Henry Rotich, who was charged with graft.
I believe that the above actions are just but the beginning, and we will be conversing again in a few months' time. And I want to be held accountable for delivering on the intentions that I have declared.
Since taking charge in July last year, CS Yatani had a bumpy start, which was characterized with a biting cash crunch in the country, as well as emerging issues around growing debt. In a memo in September 2019, CS Yatani outlined austerity measures to cut down on government officers' spending. This included, among other changes, reduction in the number of individuals accompanying cabinet and principal secretaries when traveling abroad, and those individuals using commuter allowance outside working hours were to be charged. Airtime allowance was also sliced by 30%. Purchasing of furniture budget also reduced by 75%. Pending bills are another glaring issue under the Treasury's eye. When it came to county pending bills, on November 19, 2019, Yatani released a report on the persistent failure of county governments and government departments, ministries and agencies to pay pending bills. It detailed that by 30th June 2019, the National Treasury had released 65 billion shillings to county governments. 15 counties had not made any effort to clear pending bills in the financial year 2019-2020. The 15 included, among others, Narok, Machakos, Nairobi, Bomet, Mombasa, Garissa and Kiambu County. All this in lieu of the 3.02 trillion shilling national budget set for the financial year 2019-2020. Indeed, CS Yatani has a full entree even as the new year progresses. Malika Kazia, KTN News. Set for the financial year 2019.
All right, that has been just a story by Malika Kazia setting the pace for us. And of course, Ken, very interesting choice of Ukur Yatani, Treasury CS. What do you read in his appointment?
Well, a momentous week, as you said. The president has really begun 2020 in a very intentional way. he's made it clear that for far too long politics has dominated the conversation and economics. It's about time we thought about the economy. I was also surprised by the confirmation of Ukur Yatani. He's a labor economist, and definitely unemployment is a big challenge in Kenya. So he should definitely be able to weigh in on the labor crisis we have in Kenya. But I think his direction on austerity really needs to be thought a bit through, because austerity is what creates a cash crunch in the economy. And right now we have about 176 billion circulating in an economy of 50 million people. That's far too low for any modern economy. So if he pursues that austerity path, we might go into what the European countries went into after the global financial crisis, which was just south. It should be about stimulus right now, injecting more liquidity into the economy. So the sooner he gets that change, I think the better.
Interesting. Wahoro Ndoho, of course, you served in Treasury as the Director of Debt. And it's also believed that Treasury is the engine of the country when it comes to running the economy.
Right.
For Ukur, did it come as a surprise to you?
No, not really, because I think to a large extent, one of the currencies of financial stability is continuity. At the extent to which Yatani has been substantively confirmed is good for that sense of continuity. Beyond that, what other motivation would be around that? He has a good team around him, and it's true that one of the critical things he'll have to look at is debt, and in fact, probably more than anything, the ability of us as a country to find a way to manage through it, because that's a standing charge on the consolidated fund. So before you think of wages, before you think of paying any other bills, you must pay your debts first. And so, yeah.
But do we have the money?
He'll need to be a bit of a magician, but also I think the mood or the direction to cut back on cost, what I call fiscal consolidation, is a good move as far as government is concerned. I think to my colleague's point, it's good for the government to be more careful how it spends its money, as long as it then spends, it releases the economy to function more. So that's when a government dominates expenditure, then it creates a problem, because then it basically crowds out the private sector. So to some extent, I think it's a good start. Fiscal consolidation is important. But I think, like you rightly pointed out, the conversation about debt, another president mentioned that this is the first of many. So I expect there will be another conversation around the debt management process and how they plan to go about that, because that is really the elephant in the room.
Interesting. And Ken, throwing it back to you, of course, Ukur has steered the docket in an acting capacity for about 6 months. Thereafter, he has been confirmed. Sitting in his position, looking at the state of the economy, we are seeing companies are laying off staff. We're also seeing a lot of hue and cry when it comes to taxes. And at the same time, you need to collect so that you can fund recurrent and development expenditure. He finds himself really in a very tight corner.
It's a very tight corner, and he'll need to have incredible skills to get the economy out of this. I've argued that Kenya needs what is called a quantitative easing, where money is injected in the economy. Because unless we have liquidity levels restored, what you're going to have is aggregate demand will be very weak, purchasing power will be very low, and people will not buy goods and services, and companies will continue not meeting their targets and shutting down. What we need is, he needs to reflect on Ben Bernanke in his book, Courage to Act, that this is a time to inject liquidity in the system, and it takes a bold person to be able to do that, because a lot of people fear inflation when you do that. A lot of people fear many things, but it needs a lot of courage, and he needs to step up to that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wahoro, it's a very dicey situation for President Uhuru Kenyatta, of course, taking up the BBI initiative. The Mount Kenya is also raising questions as to how the development agenda has been driven. And we have an interesting report that takes a look at some of the key initiatives the president did announce, of course, one of them being the dairy sector, Let's take a look at this particular clip first.
Milk farmers have long complained of low prices for the commodity. The situation gets worse when their yields increase during the rainy season. New KCC and other processors have been buying milk at between 19 shillings and 27 shillings at the farm gate.
Tulikuwa tunauza shilingi 60, lakini sasa imebidi turudi nyuma kidogo kwa shilingi 50. Shauri ya uchumi. Tofauti ya shilingi 10. Sikia fununu mara kadhaa kwamba kuna watu wanaleta maziwa kutoka nje, wanaleta, alafu sasa ya nje ikishakuja inazidi kiwango cha wanunuzi. Sasa inafanya mpaka mnakuwa na mabishano makali sana.
But farmers can now breathe a sigh of relief as the National Treasury releases 500 million shillings to new KCC. The money will go into purchasing excess milk from farmers and convert it into powdered milk for future use. A further 575 million shillings will go into completing 2 milk plants in Nyeri and Nyahururu in a bid to enhance their processing capacity.
Yes, that we have looked at the resources that have been availed and the quantities that we can process within the current capacity. In another few weeks, again, we could raise it to 35, but we think we can absorb that price increase at this particular point.
Any farmer who has been supplying milk, who has a contract with KCC, we have been receiving all the milk because we have dryers in Kitale, we have dryers in Eldred, we have dryers in Kiganjo, which we are able to convert any excess milk into milk powder, so we don't have a problem.
Forces of demand and supply have to also be considered.
This is not a static price that milk will be bought at a 3. There are many other players in the dairy sector. Every processor in this country will have their own pricing. They will react to this, and we expect that as KCC, our main responsibility is to stabilize the industry.
The 1.07 billion shillings announced by President Kenyatta is part of the 2 billion shillings requested by the state processor. Even as the government promises to tighten the noose on milk products suspected to be imported from outside the East African community, the cost of milk production is also a key element.
This 16% VAT is not retaliatory. It is the same that is also obtaining in Uganda and in Tanzania. So we are leveling the playing field until we then harmonize so that we remove the VAT.
We are still producing 8 liters per cow as an average. That will really pose a challenge. So we must address the component of cost of production, the cost of the productivity at the farm level, so that at least we are able to be competitive.
Milk production has grown due to conducive weather conditions from a monthly average of about 15 million litres a year ago to 62 million litres produced per month. Brenda Kirubo, KTN News.
So that report ushers us to our second area of discussion. And gentlemen, one of the major hallmarks of central Kenya is the fact that the dairy sector is the bread and butter. Majority of the locals there are in the dairy industry. And one of the big conversations on the political end as well is that the president has, quote unquote, neglected central Kenya. And some of the interpretations from his recent speech is that he's trying to calm the base, his political base. And one of the big areas that he looks at is the dairy sector. Of course, he did mention some reforms in the tea industry, but let's touch more on the dairy or horo. And looking at the first directive was to KCC to be given 500 million towards the expansion of a couple of plants in Nyanyuki and Nyahururu. And of course, the other issue is on powdered milk. He did indicate that powdered milk coming outside the East African region will get a 16% VAT. And anyone caught in the region that have actually done the productions locally, but they're selling it in the local market, all those products will be impounded. And lastly, he also touches on milk prices. Milk prices for the longest time have been stagnant at about 25 shillings a litre. Now it's at 33 shillings. And from this whole plethora of reforms, what does he aim to achieve, and is it viable in this day and time?
Yeah, so if you want me to give you the classical economic answer, I would say that, of course, let markets determine some of this. But we could know with most markets of this nature, especially in Africa, actually it's the world over, there's a certain element of interventionist government that gets into markets, and that can skew the whole mechanism for pricing. On the one hand, I think it's a good move as far as solving an immediate problem. I think you could say the same for tea, you could say for coffee, you could say for a lot of other commodities. There's also the bigger question around the structural impediments for the market finding its prices. And while in one sense, yes, it's definitely needed now, I think the bigger question around about the supply side and the demand side of this equation, we'll probably hear more maybe later, because I think it's been true for economy that for a long time, we are sort of a semi-command economy, so that there's still a lot of government intervention where markets really should be given a lot more freedom to participate. There's a second question which I don't think, which any economist will tell you, one of comparative advantage and even competitive advantage. There's something that some parts of the country are better at doing than others. To a large extent, maybe Central has been much better producing milk, but Central is not the only region that produces milk. When you look at the comparative differences between, let's say, Kenya and Uganda, and in terms of a cost per liter basis, Uganda is a far more efficient producer of milk. So you get to see why it's actually a very nuanced debate. That for now I can see how it would fix the problem now. But it would be interesting to see how now the bigger structural issue around not just milk but all our commodities is then debated. Because on that score, on that basis, you'd have to have what I call strategic interventions to correct market abnormalities. Otherwise, I think we'll probably be back here in another 6 months or a year saying again, if it's not milk, it's something else. I think it's a good place to start, but I expect there should be a lot more to happen, yes.
And Ken, what's your interpretation?
I mean, dairy sector is 14% of the agriculture segment, so it's a strategic segment. I feel it's important dairy farmers started moving up the value chain towards things like cheese and yogurt and ice creams. Competing in pure raw milk with the likes of Tanzania, Rwanda, it might not be competitive because the cost of labor is far much cheaper. The cost of doing business is far much cheaper in those countries, and we might not have a competitive advantage in the Ricardian sense. I think moving forward, this is a short-term measure. The only challenge is when you put in a 16% tax on those imports, those countries are likely to retaliate, and you'll start having trade wars. Uganda will do the same thing for Kenyan products. Tanzania will do the same thing. So you start having trade wars within the region at the time when we want to move towards an Pan-African common market. So that kind of interrupts. So it's a short-term measure, but definitely the economists within the dairy sector have to really think of how do we move our farmers into manufacturing and not just on
value addition.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good question, because the 16% I think you're saying it was an equalization measure. I think the other two already charged 16%. It was a way to lift it.
Exactly what CS Munya is saying.
I think what you're saying. So even with that, I mean, I really agree with the idea of value addition. But in fact, the question of value addition is a recurring theme through about any commodity market. For where Africa, especially Kenya is, we should have been way up the value chain by now. But that debate around what I'm saying, more structural changes in the market are things that we'll be looking at to see how the economists, the Treasury, and in government in general get to move us. Because value addition is also an expensive business. You have to invest in plant and equipment. And sometimes you can't do that on scale. You can't do it at a micro level, but like you talked about dryers, there's a very good argument for why can't we have, just as you can buy dryers for milk, well, those are the machinery that you need to move up the value chain. That's also another policy conversation, I think, that needs to happen and needs to happen fast. Yeah.
Interesting. And gentlemen, the last aspect perhaps we would also want us to just discuss is on the president did issue some interesting directives as well on the entertainment industry. And part of it is simply to make sure that the artists are able to get their royalties. At the same time, the content generators, such as Skiza Tunes, and of course, Viewsasa was also mentioned that they're actually going to be scaled down. And from a creative side of it, we also did see the president merging the Ministry of ICT. He brought in the Ministry of Youth, Gender into the ICT docket, being steered by CS Joe Musheru. And there seemingly seems to be an innovation drive that he is trying to trigger around this. I don't know, what do you read in this, Ken?
I think it's appreciated that the creative sector is a money-bringing sector in the economy, but intellectual property is a big part of the creative sector. It's only in Kenya where you'll find a celebrity who has 1 million sales in terms of music hits, but is really boarding a matatu. Can't really even fund a lifestyle. And he addressed it at the funeral of John D. Matthew. I think that was the first time he pronounced himself on that issue. I don't think it's an area that has been looked at seriously. And the fact that they're using ICT, I think ICT is a fantastic way of keeping track of what is playing. And so it's much easier to even be able to administer the kind of tax that they would. I think it's a good move because a lot of young people can make a living out of it. So I think it is a good move, but as you said, it's one of those things that it's a journey that might take a longer time. But I think the thinking of intellectual property, I think, is not just in entertainment, but in science, in innovation. A lot of young people don't want to share their ideas with the big corporates because they believe those big corporates will steal those ideas. So I think it's a broader thinking on how do we guard our intellectual property. All right.
Yeah. And we actually have institutions that are doing this. And if you're to look at economies like South Africa, Nigeria, their entertainment industries are really flourishing.
It's an interesting one because there's also the question of you're dealing with an ultra-modern, ultra-dynamic sector. The whole ICT framework and the whole question of intellectual property in the artistic world, it's a moving target. It's a very fast-moving target. And even as a government, for you to be effective, it almost means a part of your system must be able to match the sort of speed of innovation, the speed of, the realities, for example, my daughter is a musician, and the critical thing of IP, intellectual property, with a song you write in a global environment where everyone is on YouTube, everyone has,
there's so
production.
many apps.
Yes, the production has become a very personalized thing. Then for a central authority like a government to come in and find a way and seek to make it worth the artist's while, it means that the government will also have to step up the speed at which it understands the technology and can monetize it or help artists monetize it. Right. And so there's a back end of it, which I'll be very curious to see. It's one thing to have a directive, it's another thing to have the machinery behind it to make it happen.
Sure.
And that would be, I think, a very interesting conversation. I would actually say to do that, the government would be very well advised to get these young people themselves to come and tell you where the shoe pinches. How do you get, when a musician sit down with you at the table, they'll tell you, this is how we lose money specifically. And this is what you need to do specifically to fix it.
Sure.
In a sense, it has to be a market-responsive solution, solution to it, yeah.
All right, gentlemen, we are out of time, but we've really done our best to prosecute some of these key issues that have been able to characterize this very busy week where we did see President Uhuru Kenyatta reorganizing his government and, of course, instituting some very far-reaching reforms for the industry. Well, that's why we want to bring it to a close on this Friday. Well, we shall be able to get, of course, your feedback as well on our social media platforms. Feel free to engage with us on @KTN News KE, or you can tweet me @Agina Abi. And of course, remember our hashtag is KTN Business, and of course, Week in Perspective. For my panelists, thank you so much, Wahoro Ndoro, for making time. Ken Gishinga, always a pleasure having you as well.
Thanks.
And maybe if we have a minute or less, gentlemen, what should we expect now that there's been that reorganization? What will define perhaps next week some of the conversations that we should expect in less than 30 seconds?
I would like to hear more about the tea sector. I think it was a very courageous move. The back end of the tea reform is an international auction.
Okay.
So that conversation will be very interesting to follow.
All right.
Yes.
I think on Monday we have the UK Africa Summit. I think it'll be the first one ever.
Sure.
And I think it'll be huge in terms of how the UK positions itself towards Africa post-Brexit.
Fantastic. So we shall be definitely having all these discussions, of course, here on KTN Business Today. My name is Abe Gina. Do have a lovely weekend ahead and do take care. And of course, make your